Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm talking about a book prize. These, this is absolutely zero surprise to anybody ever. However, this is a book prize that I really do love, and again, that shouldn't be a surprise that I love a book prize. But this is one that I've sort of really been enjoying spending time with this year. I mentioned sort of a while ago, the Wainwright Book Prize is a prize that's around nature writing, and it's split into two shortlists, one on nature writing itself and another one on writing about conservation. And next year they'll also have one for writing around nature aimed at children or kind of young people. So this first part is going to be just about the nature writing shortlist, and then I'll do a separate one on the conservation one, otherwise this would go on for a very long time. But I was very lucky to go along to the ceremony for this prize way back in, I want to say August or September. It feels like a very long time ago. And it was very hot, and it was a boiling, gorgeous day, but it was very, very hot, and I do not deal well with the heat. So I was there with the wonderful Eric Carl Anderson over at Lonesome Reader, who was the one who kindly invited me along, sort of sweating, just like feeling like an absolute mess. I'd come straight from a work thing, I think, or something that day, or maybe I can't remember anymore. And it was just sort of this really fun, interesting kind of thing of going and seeing this event. It was sort of held at a sort of mini sort of nature reserve kind of area. It was a really gorgeous setting for the prize, but a really great introduction to what is just such a fabulous set of books and of authors. And I really want to talk about this one as well, just because nature writing is so kind of near and dear to my heart. Despite being a South London boy, I spent quite a lot of time going to sort of parks and gardens and rookeries and things like that as a kid, and I do sort of love getting a little bit lost out in nature. I mean, I say that, I also am very much a fan of creature comforts and will be like, this has been a really lovely walk, now let's go and get cake. So I'm maybe less sort of prepared for a sort of proper kind of nature thing, but anyway. But let's go on to this first shortlist, one all about nature writing, which I absolutely adored. So this shortlist, I'll sort of go through the order, but I'll start sort of by alphabetical order of the authors' names, but I will start with the winner. And the winner from this category was English Pastoral by James Rebanks. And I've spoken about, I think, all of these books separately in monthly wrap-ups, but I was so blown away by this book. I just thought it was gorgeous. So the key idea is that James Rebanks is sort of looking at his sort of family history through this sort of piece of land, through this sort of this farmland and sort of area of land that he has. And what's so fascinating about it for me is it starts in this kind of quite beautiful way of sort of talking a little bit about how, you know, sort of small village life almost, of these sort of people saying like, well, no, actually I think this tree belongs in my boundary, and no, actually I think it's in mine, and all of these sort of little petty squabbles. But actually very quickly becomes this book that is so fascinating about the kind of, and a really passionate defense of sort of traditional farming systems and traditional ways of working the land. So James Rebanks charts how sort of initially with this piece of land, there is this real tension between sort of the need to modernize, and by modernize it's very much use certain chemicals, use certain techniques, bring in certain bits of machinery, all of those sorts of things to increase the sort of the output of the land. And whereas that has a big impact in some ways, he talks about actually how there are lots of unseen problems with that. So what that starts doing is meaning that certain practices that would keep the soil really healthy aren't carried through. So actually the soil will be really good for a few years and then will be useless afterwards. And he compares this to the sort of a sort of friend of his father's who sort of passed away sort of as this book was sort of taking place. And this sort of friend of the family with his old sort of traditional styles. You know, it's seen as much less profitable, it's seen as really outdated and old-fashioned, but actually what this man is doing with his land means that he has some of the healthiest soil around and has sort of the animals that are living in really great conditions. And whereas on the surface people, you know, that doesn't sound like the sort of sexiest thing of like, ooh, your soil is so good. What they actually then pick up is actually the biodiversity of that land means that not only is it incredibly useful environmentally with things like carbon capture, but actually over time this piece of land will be more effective at growing various crops and sort of supporting animals and supporting livestock and creatures all around it. And again, not exactly the sexiest or most interesting thing at first glance, but what is really powerful about this is that actually this is how, you know, there's a reason that this long-lasting knowledge has been passed on, because it has a real impact on land. And you know, if we are to have a future of growing crops and doing whatever, we need these kinds of things, even if that's sort of often as simple as letting certain shrubs grow, even though that they are sort of seen as eyesores or seen as getting in the way, because actually they are part of the whole ecosystem. And I think that's what's the most really, yeah, really for me, the most powerful part of this book is understanding the kind of interconnectedness of everything with nature. And this is something that always fascinates me, and something that will come up across all 7 books that I'm about to mention in this shortlist. But the interconnectedness within nature is just so brilliantly captured in this book, and it actually becomes quite an angry book in a really powerful way of sort of, it basically is a passionate defense of the land and how we should be looking after it. And it's sort of a critique in many ways of over-intensive farming and sort of some methods, which I found really quite captivating. Next up is this really tiny and beautiful little book called The Screaming Sky by Charles Foster. And this is a book all about swallows, the birds. And it's just, oh sorry, swifts even. And what's so brilliant about this is it's just, it was interesting actually being at the ceremony for the prize, because they did a few interviews with some of the authors, and Charles Foster was just this wonderful kind of eccentric man who was just sort of so enthusiastic about swifts and loves them. And this really comes out in the book. It's, you know, just a year's sort of diary following swifts, talking a bit about their migration patterns, talking about how they interact with the world. But it's so tender and beautiful, and I found it just really quite engaging and quite entertaining. This sort of man just sort of talks about all the bits of sort of swifts that he loves and how they're really, you know, how they mean so much in our landscape. And it's sort of full of these like really pretty sort of pages of diagrams and everything as well. And what I just thought was so special about this as a book is it's just tender and heartwarming. It's just this beautiful celebration of life and watching how these sort of swifts move from place to place as they go, and what that kind of means for nature around. So, you know, the fact as well that they're becoming less and less common, kind of partly because of sort of human impacts on not only the environment more generally and about kind of temperature changes, but also the places that they would traditionally roost in are sort of also being disrupted, and how as a result you've got, yeah, these sort of group of birds that we're losing something quite important here. That there is this real sense that these birds could sort of become no more, or could become incredibly rare because of human activity. But if nothing else, this book just reads as a bit of a love letter to swifts, which is just so gorgeous and just really fun. And it's a tiny little book. It's about 160 pages, and it's just fun. It's just a nice, lovely book, celebrating life and celebrating nature, and I really enjoyed it. Next up is Featherhood by Charlie Gilmour, which I finished only recently, and I just thought this was, again, so much fun. You'll hear this a lot from me. I love nature, and so pretty much anything about nature I'm like, yes, this is great. But I think what's so special about this book is it goes to quite a few depths that I was not expecting. So that the key idea of Featherhood, and you may obviously notice the sort of play on the word fatherhood, is Charlie Gilmour starts looking after a baby sort of, I believe it's a magpie, and so what doesn't seem like it would make sense at first is just how it kind of connects in with everything. And you'd sort of think, well, okay, great, he's raising a little magpie. what does this mean? Why should I care? And what's actually really quite special is there's this sort of split narrative almost where there's this sort of second storyline where he's really talking about his relationship with his father, his sort of biological father. We learned quite early on that Charlie was adopted as a child, and sort of as a result, well, it's brought into a new family, and so there's this kind of other father figure who is just really distant, but also had this sort of old story of raising a jackdaw, and so there's this kind of parallel between the two men, which is really touching and really beautiful in itself. But I think what then really starts to bring this book to the next level of just being so fascinating is Charlie is incredibly open about his own struggles with mental health, his own struggles sort of, at one point he describes having a manic episode that resulted in him tearing down a flag from a cenotaph during a protest, which ended up with him being in prison. And there's this real kind of, we're watching as this sort of man has sort of grown into adulthood, really trying to kind of understand himself and who he is, not only in terms of his family identity, but in terms of his mental health and in terms of so many other things. And in the midst of this, he's raising this little bird, and it's described in such beautiful terms because we watch as this bird has all these little kind of character quirks and personality aspects that are just so engaging. So we watch as this bird starts to sort of dart around the house, and at one point starts mimicking voices, and starts just repeating the word Trump, and it kind of tries building this little nest, and at one point it starts seeming to get sort of jealous of other people who are not Charlie Gilmour, sort of who seem to be close to him, and around this sort of time it's sort of believed this is sort of the bird in a kind of mating season getting very territorial over its sort of lover and its sort of owner and all these sorts of things, and Charlie's father and all these other characters. And it's so brilliant and heartwarming and beautiful and funny, but at the same time there's this real undercurrent of something, this real sort of inner struggle that Charlie Gilmour's going through that is just so beautiful. And I was completely, I was really blown away by this. I just thought it was so much fun, and again just such a heartwarming read to follow this bird through its life, and the way that this bird sort of is really not wanting to go back and be in the natural world. It wants to sort of be a little home bird and live with Charlie. And I just, it's a really fun read. And I think this is, again, a book that I don't think I would have heard of at all were it not for the prize. And I'm really glad that I was able to read this. It's beautiful. Next up is a book that I spoke about very lovingly in a previous video, so it will come as no surprise that this is one that I absolutely adored on this list. This is Marc Hammer with Seed to Dust. And this is all a story of this man, Marc Hammer, who is a gardener in kind of quite a big garden of this kind of quite fancy sort of old house, with this sort of older woman who is the one kind of, asking for certain things to be done. And over the course of this sort of him working in the garden, it's told in sort of almost diary-like fragments. The two of them have this really interesting relationship that feels so affectionate and like there's a kind of mutual understanding, but both while almost entirely not talking to each other. And Marc will talk about kind of going home and having these conversations with his wife about the sort of things that are happening in the garden. But there's a real tenderness and beauty to this book, not only in describing just the kind of the beauty of this garden and the things that are happening, but in the language. This is probably, I think, is for me one of my favorite books of the year in terms of just how it's captured that language. There's a real, it's almost, it's very spare with its language at times. So sometimes you'll have these really short sentences just to kind of convey something, but that really just sort of pack a real punch and are just so beautiful. And sort of on the other hand, we'll have these really florid, beautiful descriptions of what's happening in the world, and sort of happening in this garden. And we get sort of little glimpses into Marc Hammer's life. So him for a while living, for a while being homeless, and the sort of transformation that has had sort of being homeless for a while and really struggling with various aspects of mental health, and then being this person in the garden with this almost, and the language again almost reflects that kind of solitary nature of being a gardener. This sort of, on one hand, this real sort of communion with nature and this real beauty that comes with sort of these beautiful descriptions and sort of wonder. But then also these very short sentences, because he basically spends most of his day not talking. He spends most of his day working in a sort of really solitary way to kind of put, to plant, to care for these plants and flowers and everything, and kind of get everything blooming. And I was just so charmed by this book. It's one of those books that, it's about 400 or so pages long, and I was just so there for the whole journey. I just found it so gripping and stunning all the way throughout. So yeah, this is as much as I think James Rebanks' English Pastoral was a very, very worthy winner. If it hadn't been that book, I would have had Sea to Dust as my winner, because I think this is just sublime and just an absolutely stunning piece of work. Next up, we have Kerri Dochartaigh with Thin Places, and this is a book where Kerri charts her recovery in some ways and her attempt at healing from various parts of trauma, and interweaves it with these ideas around thin places, which are this sort of idea of a place where the barriers between between our physical world and a more spiritual one are at their thinnest and sort of the most sort of permeable. And at the same time, it explores this idea of various other thin places, of where there are barriers or boundaries that are not particularly physical. So she relates this, for example, to the borders between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, where, yes, there is some kind of demarcated line, but at the same time it's a line that feels very confusing to many people, and particularly for nature is a line that doesn't exist. Animals will happily cross that border because for them that's not a thing. And so there's this really interesting parallel drawn throughout this book between these various thin places, and this book is just gorgeous and sumptuous in terms of its language. It's really rich, and at times it reads almost like sort of prose poetry, or reads almost kind of like a performance piece or something really kind of like that. It's so beautiful in parts. I will say, I think there are other bits that are not as much that, which is a nice kind of counterbalance actually, I think. But she, for example, in talking about her own need for healing, particularly facing various bits of trauma, facing kind of addictions and sort of bad situations, the thin places start to take on this additional level of and sort of layer of what are the kind of points where she can start to heal, where are these small boundaries that need to be crossed to make things happen. And I thought this was beautiful. I just thought it was a really gorgeous book, and hearing her speak about it at the event was also beautiful. Just she was saying how it was interesting because often people didn't necessarily know where to put this book kind of in a bookshop, because it's kind of nature writing, it's kind of about trauma, it's kind of a little bit self-help, it's kind of a bit of everything and nothing and everything in between, and yeah, I just thought this was a really, really well done book. And again, great to see a prize like the Wainwright give it an extra little nudge into people's laps. Next up is Anita Seti with I Belong Here, and I read an advanced copy of this what feels like ages ago. It feels like several years ago. I think it was April or May or something. Anyway, this book is a really beautiful story of a woman, Anita Seti herself, going on this trip along a trail, a sort of nature trail in the north of England. And this sort of all started from this idea, well, from a really quite horrible situation, which was her being racially abused on a train. And it was, a train, I think she was taking to Manchester, which is, sort of around where she's from. And so she sort of found it quite strange, because this sort of stranger who was hurling abuse at her, said, go back to where you come from, or like, you don't belong here, and all these really you know, racist and tired phrases around things like that. And she found it kind of interesting. Well, I mean, obviously found it horrible, and it was. And I think the thing that was even worse about it as well was that apparently, you know, nobody else on the train sort of intervened and stopped this man and all of these kinds of things. But what she then sort of does from that, I think, is really beautiful and really powerful, to take this horrible experience and reclaim her sort of identity of who she is and what belongs to us all. And so she goes on this nature trail, and she, you know, at one point passes through places she grew up around and all of these sorts of things. And in doing so, makes a really powerful case that, you know, nature belongs to everybody. But also that these are the lands that she grew up around. You know, it's often as well spoken about as if the United Kingdom has always been full of the same monocultural white people throughout its existence. That's not the case. There were many, for example, like North African people living in the UK sort of hundreds and hundreds of years ago, as you know, sort of with things like the Roman Empire and various other things happening. So actually this is not new, but she found that really interesting, and something I commented on when I first read it, and something that I think is a real additional plus point to this book, and something I really devoured and loved, was she then explores various words that we use to describe bits of the landscape, and how they are also words that talk about violence and acts of violence. So for example, scar or fell, and these words have kind of other meanings within nature. And so she does this really interesting, there's this really interesting passage where she flips that on its head and talks about kind of almost turning the scars of that have happened to her into something quite beautiful, and actually thinking about them differently. You know, the scars inflicted on her are also a landmark of some kind. They're also a thing that kind of shows her who she is right now and what she's been through. And I thought this was just so well done, and it's just a really interesting book. And I think, again, really quite clever to weave in these ideas of race and identity and violence, and mix that in with nature in just this really interesting and beautiful way. And so yeah, I'm really excited to read more of her work in future. I just think she's got a really interesting take, and I really love the way she sort of took everything that happened and really reframed it and turned it into this book that is both really angry but also really full of love. And I thought that was great. And last but not least, Raynawynn with The Wild Silence. So I adored her book, The Salt Path. And for those of you who, if you've not read it, it basically, The Salt Path it starts basically at quite a dark point in Raynawynn's life. So she, things had been going well, but pretty much on the same day, I think it was, she not only lost a court case around the farm she'd been living on, which basically meant that they were suddenly destitute, they had nowhere to live, they had no money, they had no security, but also that her partner, Moth, just had this really horrible chronic condition, this really chronic pain, and they are basically at their absolute rock bottom. And what they decide to do in Salt Path is to go on this long walk, and this long kind of trail along the sort of Salt Path is sort of their way of sort of healing and recovering. And kind of like I've been saying with a few of these other books, the idea of around nature being a kind of source of healing and a source of recuperation is so powerful. And I absolutely adored that book, and The Wild Silence is the follow-up to that. And it takes a little bit of a different turn in some ways. So there is a nature trail, there are a few bits about her, but in many ways it's sort of kind of what happened next. So she talks about coming off this trail. She starts, you know, her partner Moth starts this university course. They're still sort of scrounging together money and trying to make ends meet and sort of everything, but they're finally for once sort of in one place. But at the same time, they start noticing that now that they're a little bit more cut off from nature, Moth's sort of health kind of keeps getting worse. And she also starts writing at this time, Raynawynn, and so we basically learn the sort of the history of her writing The Salt Path, and sort of going to speak at events and all of these other moments. And then we kind of sort of towards the end have this trip that they take again in nature, but this time in Iceland, and not the supermarket obviously, but they have this really beautiful trip where they're basically again isolated in nature, but in very, very different circumstances. So whereas in the Salt Path they kind of went a little bit from town to town and sort of did wild camping and a few other things, in the trip around Iceland they are far more cut off. There is a real fear that if a blizzard comes in, they are screwed, because it's just such harsh conditions, and they suddenly feel really up against it. But I think what again is really brilliant about the book is the way it talks about nature not only as this source of healing, but as this potential source of danger, that we are tiny in comparison to nature and it can destroy us. And which is, I don't know why I'm laughing saying that, like, nature can destroy us, but in the sense that kind of the awe of it. And without kind of sounding like I'm sort of name dropping a little bit, when I went to the Niagara Falls, the thing I found most kind of absolutely captivating about it was suddenly realizing how tiny I was, that this sort of suddenly this sort of incredibly gorgeous sort of sight to go and see is also something that if we didn't take precautions would just kill us. Like, we would just, that volume of water, that kind of power is awe-inspiring. And I think that's something that comes up in the Wild Silence, of really understanding the kind of the power of nature. And I know some people, perhaps a little bit myself included, sort of, this book is very different from the Salt Path in some ways. It still has Raynawynn's gorgeous writing, but it is a little bit different. And I think at times it can feel a bit strange to realise just how different it is, because you suddenly realise that you're looking at a very, very different story. It's kind of the next stage. But I still think this is such a beautiful book, talking about the idea of why nature is so important and so powerful in our lives. And at the same time, there's this sort of family story woven into everything. And that brings us to the end of the shortlist, at least for this one prize, for the Nature Writing Prize. But there is a second shortlist, which I'll talk about in a separate video about conservation, just so this doesn't go on for too long, because I could talk about these things for hours, as you have seen. But I just think these 7 books are just such a brilliant display of nature writing, and I just think are really beautiful in their own ways, not only in the kind of the themes that come up regularly about the interconnectedness of nature, the sort of healing power of nature, but also just this real awe that it can bring out, whether it's watching swifts fly around, whether it's built, sort of constructing this beautiful garden, whether it's sort of raising a magpie or a little young bird. All of these things are both outside of us, but are also us. And I just think these books are so brilliant, and I love that there is a nature prize that can celebrate books like these, because I thoroughly enjoyed all 7 of these, which you can't often say for every shortlist. So I really urge you to check any of them out that you think might be of interest to you. As I said, for me, English Pastoral and Seed to Dust are both just 2 phenomenal books, but I think all 7 of these books are well worth your time. I think something like I Belong Here by Anita Seti is just brilliant. I think it's so powerful how it captures things about the landscape and who gets to kind of claim ownership. And I think other books kind of like Thin Places, looking at trauma. It's a great list, and I do urge you to check them out, and or to buy them for the nature lover in your life who may appreciate those as a gift in some way. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker, talking about this first shortlist from the Wainwright Prize. I'll be back shortly with a second for the other shortlist, but enjoy these books and take care. Speak to you all soon. Bye bye.